Research Center continues to provide access to digital and physical archival collections, and they're doing so much more. Today, I talk one-on-one with the Executive Director of the Center, Dr. Tamara Butler, for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Dr. Tamara Butler, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be back.
Yes, ma'am. You are the Executive Director of the Avery Research Center, which is a couple of blocks from where I'm sitting right now. And obviously, it's been established as such a university institution for many people, particularly African Americans. It was established in 1985 because of its missions of the Avery Research Center to evaluate, acquire, organize, preserve, and actually make available materials that promote the unique history and culture of the African diaspora, that is, with the emphasis on Charleston and the South Carolina Low Country. Let me ask you this, Dr. Butler. What's new? What's now at the center?
Well, thank you so much for having me. So new things that are going on. We are wrapping up. We're wrapping up a grant. We just finished. We received $100,000 from the Donnelly Foundation for a project called Documenting the Arc. So that grant has wrapped up, where we were interested in looking at history, how the history of civil rights and the struggle for Black freedom and Black lives has really gone beyond the 60s. So we were interested in people and activism after Mother Emanuel, as well as the murder of Walter Scott. And so we hired a local celebrity and well-renowned scholar to come out and do oral history interviews for us. And so it was Dr. Millicent Brown. We interviewed 33 community members, organizers, activists who were participating in thinking about organizing and mobilizing after 2015 up until the present. So,
what is the activism now after Walter Scott and Mother Emanuel?
So what is the activism? I think it really depends. So most of the activists are in the story, so they should be available online in the upcoming year or so. Some of the things that people were really interested in is thinking about mobilizing at different levels. So you have everything from attending protests to meeting and thinking about what will be the next policy moves. How do you actually ask for it and ensure that there's a trial for the assailant in Mother Emanuel? How do you ensure there's also a trial for the police officer that shot Walter Scott? So it's really asking the question of what policies need to be in place. And so activism happens on multiple levels in terms of the mobilizing of people, also the mobilizing of policies, also the mobilizing and bringing organizations together, because so often when we think about activism, there's often a time to divide and help people. And so we know that, said that usually in South Africa, there's this quote that once you strike a woman, you strike a rock, right? You strike a boulder. And so same thing with thinking about like a fist and thinking about this concept of like, how do we move away from separate entities trying to work towards something and actually coming together? And so a lot of the activism was also bringing the right people into the room together to think about what should be some of the next steps, and that we're sharing the same narrative, we're sharing the same vision, or at least a similar vision, I should say, of liberation.
What is that vision right now from an Avery perspective?
So our perspective is our vision hasn't changed much. You know, we were a school in 1865 up until 1954. When we did become the Avery Research Center, the only shift was that we weren't teaching classes and offering diplomas and degrees, but we still, to this day, are very much rooted in education. So it's getting people to understand that our archives are not dead. They are constantly growing and living, helping people understand the difference between an archive, a museum, and a library, offering public programming, generating intergenerational conversations through lectures, movies, kind of showcasing local artists. So our vision is that if we're going to get free, that education is like one of the things you need. And part of it is not just about, reading, writing, and arithmetic, so to speak, but it's also like looking at what has history taught us. Has there been a blueprint that we could follow, but also is there Are there missteps that might have been taken that might not be completely applicable now, but you can't do that without study. And so at the center of our work is the idea of educating, showing people how to use the resources, how to read the resources, and then getting into the practice of incorporating the theories into the work that you do.
Brings me to my next question, Dr. Butler. What is Avery's blueprint that will actually allow you all to move into the future?
So our biggest blueprint is that we put at the crux of it. I think when we think about individuals who thought it was important to not only teach, because you could teach, people they could have continued to teach in a church, right? They could have taught at somebody's house. But the blueprint is that we build things. So the fact that our bricks have, the fingerprints of ancestors in it, and not just enslaved ancestors as we see so often across the city, but of emancipated Black people who thought that the next step after emancipation is education. So within the institution of slavery, there people are already engaged in education. So to think that outside of it is like, great, I want to create a safe haven, a space for African Americans to teach the things that are relevant to them. And so for us, that blueprint still exists, is that if we want anything to change, we have to build something, right? We have to build or some things where we can organize, we can find safe haven, where we can reflect, where we can regroup. And so that helps us to understand that the building that we're in, that we are good stewards of it, that people understand that of the multiple things on the peninsula, is one of the few that were built by the hands of emancipated Black people that still stands in its original context, right? So we think about the churches and the schools and the other things that were built that have either been demolished or transformed into homes that may not be serving that same original purpose. And so for us, the blueprint is, how do we continue to reclaim a space for ourselves to regenerate? And so we use that and make sure that the space has multiple purposes, but at the crux of it is history. So that's why the archives really takes up the most space in our building, and understanding that our archives should really take up that much space in our lives and guide us into the next thing.
This might be a redundant question, Dr. Butler, but what is Avery's responsibility to educate?
Sure. I mean, we were left with the responsibility to educate at all levels. So our responsibility, so we started out as a school that educated K through 12. We continue that. So we offer scholarships, internships to high school students, to undergraduate students, to graduate students. We also educate in that our archives are free and open to the public. We just ask that people make an appointment. We offer our staff are well-equipped public historians, people who have been trained in their fields and working as public history professionals. So for us, the education is at every level. So at K-12, there's scholarships. At high school, at the college level, we offer the James Campbell Social Justice Award for high school, for College Charleston and historically Black colleges. We also have the Karen Chambers Fellowship that is for graduate students who are interested in African American history, that they can use that stipend to further their research. And then the last part is that we cycle back to K-12, and that we have the Avery Teachers of the Year. So any teacher that applies and can demonstrate that they've really thought about intentional use and intentional teaching of African American history and culture in their classroom, or taking a critical, caring, responsive approach to teaching. Those teachers can then apply. They're usually nominated by someone who's watching them, and they are then awarded a stipend, so that cycle never stops, right? So we hope to continue to support teachers who are then going to help in the cultivating of dynamic K-12 students, who will then go on to be great college students, great grad students, and finally, some dynamic professional, creative, or hopefully even an educator.
Okay, so what method are you currently using to help create critical educators in the era of Avery and soon to be the IAAM?
Yeah, so for us, some of the things that we're doing is building partnerships. I think so often people build a thing and it doesn't necessarily respond to what people want. And so I think specifically, Avery was built with the intention of education. So we ask people, what do you need? The teachers, what is it that you need? So we've been, as a result, we also leave ourselves a little open in the sense that we've been asked by local school districts to come in and give professional development, to offer inspiration. I've often been called upon to give keynotes to teachers across the U.S. and so as my staff. And so in terms of thinking about a critical educator, I mean, we have primary sources that we really hope that teachers will use in their teaching. Anything from, letters written by Septima Clark to transcripts of interviews from the Sea Islands to, I think one of the things that seems to be a popular piece of history is the William and Ellen Crafts publication, Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom. And getting people to see that like history has so much to offer. And so for us, if we can get teachers to bring their students into the building, if not, then we have made a lot of material available digitally that individuals can use. And so in that partnership, as a result, we ask teachers, we ask educators of all shapes and sizes and levels of what is it that you need. And we keep hearing that sometimes it's not that the teachers don't have the materials, right? Because we have it if you need it. But sometimes the teachers just need a breathe, need a moment to breathe. They need a space to be imaginative and to be creative. And so we also offer platforms. Like I think not too long ago, earlier this year, I did a conversation with a local school counselor, Jamisha Means, to talk about how can we think about wellness for our young people, and wellness for our teachers. In the upcoming weeks, we're doing a conversation with AJ Davis, who is a media specialist at Burke High School, right? So just kind of thinking about also offering teachers a platform to demonstrate that they are professionals, and reminding the larger community that teaching is a profession, right? It's not a hobby. It's a thing that comes with that. There's a science and art, a training, and a responsibility. And so, in thinking about the upcoming IAM, we leave that up to them. We've been in conversations about how do we want to partner. I know that they've hired a new director of education. And so, we're really brainstorming how will we work together. One thing that we can say with confidence is that if IAM feels overwhelmed at any point with the request, because there's going to be an influx of requests, that one thing that we can offer is an intentional focus on South Carolina and Charleston that might be able to alleviate some of the pressure of like, where do I go for additional resources? So we can create pathways to one another to help people understand the story of the Black diaspora and of the African experience.
And Dr. Butler, let me ask you this. So let's fast forward to January, and the IAM is there and obviously open. What ways are you working on right now to be innovative and creative so that Avery can still be relevant?
Well, Avery's always relevant. So no, I'm just kidding. So I think I'm just being serious. So I think one of the things is with Avery continuing, we have things in the pipeline. So, we're applying for funding. I know that the College of Charleston has received some funding to take on some new projects. We also have, we're so excited to acquire the recording of Martin Luther King when he visited Esau Jenkins and Jackie Jefferson when they were all speaking here in the city of Charleston, and so at County Hall. And so for us, we want people to think about what does it mean to bring history home. So for us, IAAM is an opportunity to open up a gateway, right? So if people are coming in to the city and they want to understand and kind of like an international, a global view of what it means to be Black, then great. We want you to start there. You cannot leave Charleston without coming to Avery because you'll miss an opportunity, right? It's built on the grounds in which individuals were brought into, were introduced to the United States. And if we're strategic, you can travel down Calhoun Street and start to make sense of what are the things that are at play. So you have, if you're leaving IAM and you see Mother Emanuel, right? You see Marion Square, which is not owned by the city, right? And so you have that space that has its own tensions, and then to continue down Calhoun to have the College of Charleston on Cumming Street once existed, McLennan Banks Hospital. And then to keep going, you finally run into an area where you can start to walk a little bit into Avery. And so for us, it's like, if you are intentional, you will see that there's a larger story to be unraveled. So where do people go once they came into this port? How do we make sense of urban slavery? How do we make sense of Denmark VZ? How do we make sense of Reconstruction? How do we make sense of what does it mean for Black people to demand, fight for, and build their own versions of liberation? So for us, we stay relevant in the sense that we offer programs, we're applying for grants, we have several collections that need to be processed, and we hope that people will also see that we are good stewards of our own history. And so in our relevancy is helping people understand the difference between a museum, an archive, and a library, because since 1985, we've been all three. Yeah. And once people start to wrap their minds around it, then they understand that, we have a mission to collect and preserve. That's at the crux of what we do. And as a result of that, if we're collecting and preserving, we've also been attracting scholars who want to find you. So if your family's documents aren't at Avery and they're in your grandmama's basement, how are we going to find you? So that's our call to relevancy, is that we hold so much of Charleston's history and demonstrating how Charleston has always been a beacon in the fight for resistance, in the fight for justice.
And Dr. Butler, what else, when it comes to Black history, do you all at Avery want to unravel?
Say it again. So is there something we want to unravel?
Yes, ma'am. What else do you want to unravel when it comes to Black history?
I think we want to unravel complacency. I think so often when people come to the city of Charleston or just think about Black history, there's a misunderstanding that people are complacent. There's a misunderstanding that there's only Black leaders, just one leader that everybody runs behind. That there's a misunderstanding that Black history is retaliatory and reactive. Black people are not that, right? Black history is not that. Black history is very much rooted in a desire to live, a desire to dream, and nuance, right? So I think we have a lot of understandings about who we think people were, but when you get in the archives, this applies to everybody. You dig in the archive and it's like, oh, this person actually had a change in ideology. Oh, this moment really catalyzed this person. Before that, they were thinking of something else. And that in history, in Black history in particular, there's no level of complacency, because complacency equals stagnation. So I think we're at a moment where I think there are individuals who are pretty complacent and who have bought into we're post-racial, post-racist, we're post, and I'm like, I don't think we're there. Right. And it's starting to come back to us, to understanding that if we're serious about the unraveling of Black history, it's also understanding that we're not about hate. I think so often legislation and narratives, specifically thinking about like the anti-critical race theory legislation, really has people misunderstanding what people are asking you to think about. Okay, if this country is built on racism, right? If it's built on these principles of superiority and inferiority, then what's at the crux of that? It's not that Black people hate white people, right? It's not that white people hate Black people. It's an idea of fear. It's an idea of fear and a lack of love. And so my hope is that as we really think about, and also getting people to unravel the fact that Black history is not just critical race theory. I want people to unravel that for me. But at Avery, we want people to also understand that history is not linear. So what we cannot afford to do is we cannot afford to say, because this thing happened at this moment, that it is a direct correlation to what's happening in this moment. There's a lot of zigzags in the middle that get us there. But until you actually unpack all the different dots along that history, people will take parts of Black history and exaggerate it, right? The Willie Lynch letter is one example. People will make up things like the Gullah Wars. People will do a lot of those things that it's like historically there is no documentation that those things are connected in that way. So as a result, when we get to the 21st century, how much of the past have we brought with us? And because I think that there's something that really unravels me is the way that we do not think through all the points in history. And we also assume, this is my last point, is that we also assume that Black history is only in America. There's something to be said for the communication that is had between Black people globally, in which American culture influences American resistance and Caribbean resistance and resistance on the continent and resistance in South Asia. All those things influence one another. So for whatever reason, we have always been a global people who are looking to global audiences and comrades in order to fight locally. That's always who we've been. And I say that because I look at the life of Ellen and William Craft, who left Georgia, who escaped Georgia, right, in the 1840s. They make their way through to Boston. They get to Nova Scotia. And after the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, they get to Nova Scotia. They leave Nova Scotia and end up in London, where they start to talk about abolishing slavery. You're talking to the monarchy, right? You're talking to the place that colonized and say slavery has to stop. You have to cut that out in the colonies. Once the Civil War ends, they return to the U.S. They return to Georgia. Their son moves to Charleston. Their descendants still live here. So I say that to say that we have to think a little bit more that Black history, in order for it to make sense, we cannot think linearly. We cannot think in a straight line. That this meant this equaled this and this equaled this, and now we're here. We also have to understand that we've always had a global mind. Always. And so until we get people to realize like our struggle has been and continues to be looking at global, we're never going to get we're never going to get the full picture of what Black history is.
What other parts of Black history is actually exaggerated in your mind?
I think that there are people who exaggerate, and I say this cautiously.
Okay.
So I think there's two moments where I think that there's an exaggeration, and I think some of it is also a romanticizing. So the exaggeration comes in the conversations about how Black bodies were used. We know that there's documentation that, possibly George Washington's teeth weren't wooden, that they were actually the teeth of enslaved people. You don't need to exaggerate that. You can look at it, right? You can go back and archaeological work and proof, right? Medical humanities, all those folks can prove that. But when people are saying that shoes and wallets and other things that you carry are made from the bodies of Black people, can you prove that? Like, we have enough, we have enough technology and tools to demonstrate that. And there's also enough horrors of slavery that it's like, is it necessary to think about the fact that people like skinning Black people and turning them into wallets? I don't know if that's necessary, right? We have enough documented atrocities that we really don't have to like lie about what was done to Black bodies. The romanticizing is also the other lie, is that, that we were happy enslaved people. And then thinking about additional romanticizations, is like thinking about civil rights, or thinking about leaders, and that everybody loved the leader, right? Everybody loved Harriet Tubman. Everybody loved Denmark Vesey. Everybody loved, Frederick Douglass. Everybody loved Martin Luther King, right? That's not, we really got to back up a little bit. So when we see the quotes flying around on the internet, when it's Black History Month, and when it's the birthdays of these individuals, it's like, oh, well, I love what they stand by. Did you read the whole text? Because they actually have more to say than the pieces you've pulled out. So you cannot romanticize these individuals as like one-dimensional, always respected, always trusted, because that wasn't the case, right? And then the last part that I think is often exaggerated, or even just maybe intentionally overlooked, is the dynamic of relationships in Black communities. So I think so often people are writing and looking at slavery, Reconstruction. You might see it more in Harlem Renaissance time, the 20s and beyond, but people don't really get to have a question and a conversation about the thriving, the existence, the endurance, the desire for same-sex relationships, right? For same-gender relationships, like that relationships are that people could actually find love and create love at all levels through time, because there's so much of a narrative in just history at large that the LGBT community just showed up one day, right? And they're taking over the world and they're scaring our kids. But I was like, these very intimate relations exist throughout time, and they existed among all people, right? Black people are no exclusion. So I think I say that because I think there's a thing that has happened where, as a result of us not being able to imagine Black queer relationships across time, it makes it really difficult for people to imagine the importance of Black queer relationships in this current moment, because we don't believe that those things existed in the past, that there's just some configuration of today. And I was like that. So that's a thing where in terms of the exaggeration or the omissions, is the existence of Black love in many forms across time.
And Dr. Butler, how is Avery reaching that is a larger audience with those conversations that you just mentioned?
So we're thinking about partners. We've been thinking about partners for a long time. We make space for conversations. We also attend to gaps that we ourselves may be facing in our own research and the way that we present programs. So I think specifically about, we had a student who won a James Campbell Award to bring attention to the lives of Black and brown queer youth, right, and queer artists. And so they established an exhibit, and it was beautiful to think about this idea like creating a space for there to be an expression of identity, of life, the vernacular, the everyday life. It's also really important to think about the fact of how many galleries on the peninsula and abroad make space for those kinds of, for that kind of expression, for those kind of visuality, for those kinds of art. And so we really like to partner with artists to think about how we can generate those conversations. We also like to think with organizations, whether they're here in the city or on campus. Think with organizers and activists. We like to think along the lines with people of like how we can start to have these conversations at to borrow from the new director of the Gender, Sexuality, Equity Center on campus, Naomi Simmons. We're thinking about intersections across our organizations, right? So what would that mean if we did a partnership with the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and GSEC, right? If we did conversations with groups like Black and Pink, or the Okra Project, individuals who are working intentionally with Black and Brown queer communities to put on programming, supporting those organizations through awareness donations, really donations, so people want to donate, but getting people to just think broadly that these communities have always coexisted within people, right? And then they've also just coexisted at large. And so we're being more intentional about our programming to ensure that we are attentive to help people understand that these histories and these realities do exist.
And what other gaps do you want to close when it comes to collection and archival at Avery?
Oh, so many gaps.
Okay.
I think a gap that we have been closing or hoping to close or fill in. One is around Black women's history. So we were able to digitize a great deal of materials through a grant in order to bring to the forefront how Black women in Charleston have been, leaders in their respective fields and across the work of social justice. The other gap that we are hoping that we want to fill is there's a larger gap in our understanding of Gullah Geechee culture, where I believe, with the prevalence and the growth, the prominence and the growth of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor Commission, you see that they're trying to bring attention to the fact that it's like the corridor is not just this land, even though South Carolina has a majority of the space, that is not just South Carolina, it's Georgia, it's North Carolina, it's Florida. But it also goes further inland. So partnering with communities like Georgetown, partnering with communities, Yamasee, other individuals who may see themselves as part of the corridor and folding their history in. And the last one is also just expanding our understanding of Black South Carolina history, because there's so many communities on the other side of the I-95 corridor who live that are like small towns, right? They're a large town, but they're like small community towns who are really trying their best to preserve their own histories. And so we'd like to help with that and making sure that we can literally put them on the map for people as they come to do research.
Well, that is really, really great to hear. And I wish I had more time, but Zoom tells me I'm out of time. But Dr. Tamara Butler with the Avery Research Center, thank you for your time. And again, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great one.
Likewise.
Thanks.